boys and girls, Miss Schultz here. How you doing today? Good, I hope. I've got a really special book to share with you, but first, what are we listening to? It's Lee Morgan, The Sidewinder. It's one of my very, very favorite jazz albums. So maybe with your parents or an older sibling, you can look up Lee Morgan on YouTube and you're gonna hear some awesome music too. I often like to listen to jazz when I'm reading. This book is a book that I bought a long time ago at a garage sale, really, but it's actually kind of a rare book. And it is called Walt Disney American Folklore. Folklore, also known as folk tales, is legends about people that lived in our country a long time ago. Maybe you've heard of Johnny Appleseed or Pecos Bill. 5th grade's a grade that you will start learning more about those, but you can hear the stories at any age. This book was written in 1956, so that's, I don't know, I need Miss Finelli here to help me with that one. I'm just gonna go on and read the story and look at the art. In this book, there are a lot of different stories. There are stories about Davy Crockett, Ichabod Crane, etc. This is the story we're going to be reading though. It's called Casey at the Bat. And before I start reading, I want us to look at the picture for just a minute. This book, there are only 2 colors per page if you're not including the white of the page. There's another author who did this all the time. As a matter of fact, almost all of his books are only 3 or 4 colors. Try to think who that is, and I'll tell you at the end of the video. Let's see if you can figure that out. They used 2 colors because they didn't have the same types of machines that we had to print really colorful pages and make it so that everybody could afford to buy it. So oftentimes they went to just 2 colors, yellow and black for this one. But in other stories they use red and black or blue and black. I like how it's simple, but I also sometimes wonder how it would be colored in. The story we're going to read is about baseball. This isn't a story with a lot of pictures though. What's really interesting is the story itself. Walt Disney loved stories. That's one reason he became such an awesome animator, because it wasn't just that he could draw really well and figure out how to make things look like they were moving. Walt Disney could tell a good story, and he collected stories by listening to them. Maybe that's something you can do while we're having to stay at home to stay safe. Maybe you could sit with a family member and have them tell you a story. Sometimes the best stories are when you ask your parents or grandparents, or maybe if you're really lucky, a great-grandparent, or even an aunt and uncle, to tell you a story about when they were your age. We don't usually remember to ask things like that, but I guarantee you're going to get some funny stories you wouldn't have heard otherwise. So back to our story. This is an old story. It was written actually in 1888, not 1988, 1888, well over 100 years old, and it's called Casey at the Bat. This is a folk tale about Casey at the bat. He's batting during a baseball game, and it's actually written as a poem. The author is Ernest L. Thayer, and he wrote all of it so that it rhymes, but it's actually really long, like a story. Again, I'm not going to hold up a lot of pictures. This is more of a story to listen to. While you're listening, try to get images or pictures in your head of what you would draw if you were going to be the illustrator for this story. The book has such old stories in it. Each story sounds a little different. What we're going to read is actually a poem, and it's well over 100 years old. The words that they used to use 100 years ago may not be the words that we would use today. Or today, we invent new words that people 100 years ago wouldn't know. I don't think anybody 100 years ago would know what a YouTuber is, do you? It's going to sound a little funny at parts, but that's what makes it really interesting, because you really have to listen to it to get the meaning and the understanding. Now, it's still about baseball. Baseball's America's oldest pastime, so it's a pretty old sport. You've just got to listen, and that's what makes it really interesting. It also has kind of a rhythm to it. because it's a poem and not a straight story. Just like Lee Morgan's jazz has a rhythm to it, words have a rhythm to it. So while it may take you a minute to listen, you may not know some of the words right away, just keep listening and I think you'll get the gist of the story. So Casey at bat. I'm going to look down, boys and girls, just like I would do in class, because I can't look at you and the book at the same time. By Ernest L. Thayer. This is a poem about a baseball player and what happened to him during the biggest game of the season. The story has been told so often that it has become part of our folklore. And Casey, poor unhappy Casey, is remembered with sympathy by every boy or girl who has ever had the same terrible experience. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2 with but one inning more to play. And then when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a sickly silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep, deep despair. The rest clung to the hope which springs eternal in the human mind. They thought if only Casey could but get a whack at that, we'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a Lulu and the latter was a cake. So upon that stricken multitude grim melancholy sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let him drive a single to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore that cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted and the men saw what had occurred, there was Johnny safe at second and Flynn a hugging third. Then from 5,000 throats and more, there rose a lusty yell. It rumbled through the valley, it rattled in the dell. It knocked upon the mountain and recoiled upon the flat, for Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing and a smile on Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance gleamed in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching in the haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches, filled with people, there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Get rid of him! Get rid of the umpire!" shouted someone in the stand, and it's likely they'd have gotten rid of him had Casey not raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew, but Casey still ignored it, and the umpire called, "Strike two!" "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and echo answered fraud. But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold, and they saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lip, his teeth are clenched in hate. He pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere, this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. that's the story of Casey at the Bat, boys and girls.